Three Jefferson Nickels, 1953D, 1979D, and 1989D may look worn, discolored, and completely ordinary. But that's exactly why most people would pass them without a second thought. Collectors and coin hunters are searching for coins like these, and these three carry a combined value of $859,000. If you have one hiding in a coin jar, drawer, or old collection, don't clean it. Don't spend it, and don't skip this video, because the tiny detail that makes these nickels so valuable could be the one thing you never thought to look for. There is something strange about this 1953 Jefferson nickel, and the first thing you notice may actually be the thing that makes you look away. At a glance, it looks like an ordinary 5-cent coin. The Jefferson portrait is familiar. The reverse looks normal, and the surfaces have that unusual yellow appearance that immediately separates this piece from the typical color of a Jefferson nickel. But here is where the story gets interesting. Sometimes, the difference that makes a coin look unusual is not the difference. That makes it important. And on a coin like this, experienced collectors know exactly where to start looking. This is the first chapter in a story about a 1953D Jefferson nickel, a coin that can appear surprisingly ordinary until you begin examining the details that most people never notice. The date tells us we are looking at a coin from the early 1950s, while the small D mint mark on the reverse, near Monticello, identifies it as a Denver Mint issue. That tiny letter may look insignificant, but for collectors, the mint mark is one of the first clues in the investigation. In 1953, the United States was still in a period of enormous change. America was entering the post-war era. Families were returning to normal life after World War II, and 5-cent coins were still everyday money. A Jefferson nickel could have passed through countless hands without anyone imagining that decades later, someone might examine the same piece under magnification, looking for clues that could completely change its story. And that is exactly what makes old nickels fascinating. Two 1953D Jefferson nickels can look almost identical to someone casually examining them. Both can have the same portrait, the same date, the same Monticello building, and the same D mint mark. One might be worth only a small amount above face value, while another example with exceptional preservation, unusual surface characteristics, a recognized variety, or a significant minting anomaly could attract serious collector attention. The difference may not be obvious from across the room. It may not even be obvious in your hand. Experienced collectors often begin with the surfaces. On this particular coin, the yellow appearance immediately raises a question. Jefferson nickels were not normally intended to have a bright yellow appearance, so an unusual color needs to be investigated rather than automatically treated as proof of rarity. It could be connected to environmental exposure, chemical alteration, toning, cleaning, or another surface reaction. In other words, color alone does not create a valuable coin, but color can create the mystery that makes you investigate everything else. That is an important distinction. If you discover a yellow-looking 1953D nickel in an old collection, don't immediately assume you have discovered a rare mint error. Instead, examine the surface carefully. Does the color appear natural and consistent? Does it look artificially altered? Are there unusual patches, spots, or changes around the lettering? Does the underlying metal appear disturbed? And then move to the second clue, the strike. Collectors know that a coin can have all the right ingredients and still fall short because the details were not struck sharply. Look closely at Jefferson's portrait, the lettering, the date, and especially the reverse design around Monticello. Weakness in certain areas can tell you something about the striking process, while unusually sharp detail can make a high-grade example stand out dramatically. Now look at the D. It sits on the reverse near Monticello, and although it is only one small letter, it tells us where this nickel was produced. The Denver Mint struck enormous numbers of coins during this era, but surviving coins did not all experience the same journey. Some were heavily circulated, scratched, worn, cleaned, exposed to chemicals, or stored poorly. Others survived with remarkable detail. That is where grading becomes critical. A nickel that spent decades in circulation will normally show contact marks, scratches, wear on Jefferson's hair and cheek, and loss of detail on the reverse. A high-grade survivor can look dramatically different. The fewer signs of circulation, the stronger the original detail, and the cleaner the surfaces, the more interesting the coin becomes to collectors. But there is another trap here. A coin can look beautiful and still have problems. Cleaning is one of the biggest issues collectors watch for. A surface that appears unusually bright or strangely colored may have been chemically treated or otherwise altered. Professional graders examine coins for these characteristics because originality matters. A coin with an attractive appearance is not automatically a coin with collectible premium value. That is why this 1953D nickel becomes a genuine investigation rather than a simple identification exercise. Could there be a minting error? Possibly, but that has to be demonstrated. Collectors look for things such as off-center strikes, double details die cracks, unusual planchet problems, missing design elements, and other recognized minting anomalies. A strange color by itself is not enough, and this is where ordinary-looking coins can become fascinating. The most valuable discovery may not announce itself. There may be no giant crack across the surface, no missing date, no spectacular deformation. Sometimes the important clue is a tiny difference that becomes visible only when the coin is compared with a normal example. Under strong magnification, that comparison can change everything. Put a normal 1953D Jefferson Nickel beside an unusual example, and suddenly the investigation becomes much easier. Look at the color. Look at the texture. Compare the lettering. Examine the date. Study Monticello. Check the mint mark. Then ask the question collectors have asked for generations. Why is this coin different? That question is more important than the number printed on a price tag, because the reported value associated with this particular example is an extraordinary $351,000. A figure like that demands caution. A coin's actual market value depends on authentication, condition, grading, originality, recognized varieties or errors, provenance, and, most importantly, what qualified buyers are willing to pay. A strange-looking nickel should never be assumed to be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars simply because of its color. But that does not make the mystery less exciting. In fact, it makes it more important. The real lesson of the 1953D Jefferson Nickel is that collectors don't simply search for old coins. They search for differences. They search for evidence. They search for the tiny details hidden inside coins that millions of people once spent without a second thought. And this nickel survived an era when 5 cents could actually buy something useful. It may have traveled through stores, pockets, cash registers, and countless transactions before eventually disappearing into someone's collection. More than 70 years later, its surface may be telling a story that the original owner could never have imagined. So if you ever find a 1953 Jefferson Nickel, don't dismiss it because it looks ordinary. Turn it over. Find the D near Monticello. Study the surface. Look closely at the strike. And most importantly, don't let an unusual color convince you that you've already solved the mystery. Sometimes the most visible clue is only a distraction from the detail collectors really care about, because the 1953D is only the beginning. There is another coin coming next where the overlooked detail is even harder to spot, and once you see what experienced collectors look for, you may never examine an old nickel the same way again. The question is, what tiny clue could be hiding in plain sight on coin number 2? The strangest thing about a 1979D Jefferson Nickel may not be something you can see immediately. It is something you discover when you ask a different question. Why do collectors treat some ordinary 5-cent coins as completely forgettable, while others from the same year can suddenly become the center of intense attention? That question takes us into the second chapter of this collection. At first glance, this 1979 Jefferson Nickel looks familiar. Jefferson faces forward, Monticello appears on the reverse, and the small D mint mark identifies the coin as a Denver Mint production. Nothing about that description sounds extraordinary, and that is precisely why this coin deserves a closer examination. In the late 1970s, nickels were still everyday spending money. A person could receive one in change, toss it into a pocket, and never look at it again. The United States was moving through a period of economic uncertainty, changing consumer habits, and rapidly evolving technology. The year 1979 also marked the beginning of a new decade, with the country approaching a very different economic environment from the one that existed when Jefferson's portrait first appeared on the nickel. Millions of these coins entered circulation, but circulation is where the story begins to divide. A typical 1979D nickel could spend years bouncing around inside cash registers, vending machines, drawers, pockets, and coin jars. Contact marks would accumulate, The highest points of the design would begin to lose their sharpness. The surfaces could become dull, scratched, or discolored. Then there were the survivors. Some examples escaped heavy circulation. Others were preserved almost immediately after leaving the mint. And when collectors compare an ordinary circulated nickel with a truly exceptional survivor, the difference can be surprisingly dramatic. Most people stop their examination here. They see the date, notice the D, perhaps check whether the coin looks old, and move on. Collectors usually focus on the date first, but specialists often look elsewhere. They study the strike. A Jefferson nickel can have a sharp-looking portrait while still, showing weakness in important areas of the reverse. Monticello's details, the lettering, and the small design. Elements can tell an experienced collector how strongly the dies transferred their design onto the planche. That matters because condition isn't simply about whether a coin looks shiny. Original surfaces matter. Sharp detail matters. The absence of damaging marks matters. And the difference between a coin that merely survived and one that survived exceptionally well can become enormous when professional grading enters the picture. Now look at the mint mark. That little D on the reverse tells us the coin came from Denver. It is easy to overlook because it occupies such a small area of the design. But mint marks are fundamental clues in coin collecting. They establish where the coin was produced and help collectors separate one issue from another. The next question is more difficult. What exactly makes one 1979D Jefferson nickel more desirable than another? The answer isn't one single feature. It is the combination. Collectors examine the surfaces for excessive contact marks. They inspect Jefferson's cheek and jaw for abrasions. They examine the fields around the portrait. On the reverse, they study Monticello and the surrounding lettering. Then they consider whether the coin retains strong original detail and whether its surfaces appear natural. The real difference appears when attention shifts to preservation. A coin can be more than 40 years old and still look remarkably fresh if it was protected from circulation and damaging storage conditions. Another coin from the exact same year can look tired and heavily worn. Same date, same denomination, same mint, completely different collector appeal. This is where grading becomes more than a number. Professional grading attempts to establish how well a coin survived and whether its condition and surfaces meet the standards expected for a particular grade. But authentication is equally important. When a coin is claimed to be extremely valuable, why? Because extraordinary prices require extraordinary evidence. An unusual-looking surface, an apparent doubling, a strange mark, or a damaged letter should not automatically be called a mint error. Coins can be scratched, altered, polished, chemically changed, or damaged after leaving the mint. Experienced collectors know the difference. They ask whether the feature was created during minting or appeared later. That distinction can completely change the story. And this is where collector psychology becomes fascinating. Collectors aren't simply buying metal. They're buying certainty, rarity, condition, history, and the possibility that they have discovered something other people overlooked. A common Jefferson nickel may be worth little more than its face value, but an exceptional example can attract attention because there are fewer truly pristine survivors than there are ordinary circulated coins. The market follows that scarcity. When several collectors want the same exceptional piece, competition can push interest far beyond what someone might expect from a 5-cent coin. That is why a coin's value cannot be understood by looking at its denomination. 5 cents is what the coin says it is. Its collectible value is a completely different story. And for this particular 1979D Jefferson nickel, that distinction becomes especially important when discussing the reported value of $293,000. Before accepting a number like that, however, collectors should ask the questions professionals ask. What is the coin's actual grade? Is it authenticated? Are the surfaces original? Is there a recognized mint error or variety? Is there documented auction history supporting the valuation? Without that evidence, a dramatic price claim is only a claim. But when an unusual coin is properly authenticated, professionally graded, and supported by credible market evidence, the conversation changes. Suddenly, the tiny details become important. The sharpness of the strike, the preservation of the surfaces, the absence of distracting damage, the originality of the appearance, the precise characteristics that separate an exceptional coin from thousands of ordinary examples. And there is one more lesson hidden inside this 1979D nickel. Collectors rarely agree that every unusual coin is valuable. They investigate, they compare, they measure, they question. That is why the smartest thing you can do when you find an interesting Jefferson nickel is not to assume you have found a fortune. Slow down, examine it, compare it with a normal example, use magnification, check the date and mint mark, study the strike, look for evidence of genuine minting characteristics rather than damage that happened later. Because sometimes the most valuable discovery is not the coin with the strangest appearance. It is the coin with the strongest evidence. And that brings us to the end of coin number 2, but not the investigation. Because despite everything this 1979D reveals about condition, preservation, grading, and collector demand, the next coin introduces a completely different kind of mystery. One small detail changes the way the entire group should be viewed. And once that detail appears, the assumptions made about the first 2 coins suddenly become much harder to trust. The final coin in this story does not look like something worth stopping for. The surface is not perfectly clean. The date is not especially easy to read. Even the mint mark requires attention. And on the reverse, nothing seems dramatically different from the Jefferson nickels most people have seen before. Yet this is exactly the kind of coin that can expose the difference between looking at a coin and actually examining one. This is a 1989D Jefferson nickel, and its story is not built around a flashy appearance. It is built around the details that remain after the obvious clues disappear. By 1989, the Jefferson nickel had already been part of American life for more than half a century. The design was familiar to generations of Americans. Jefferson's portrait appeared on the obverse, while Monticello dominated the reverse, making the coin instantly recognizable even to people who never considered themselves collectors. And that familiarity created a problem. When people see something they recognize, they stop looking. A nickel is a nickel. A date is a date. A small d is just a mint mark. But collectors know that this is exactly where important evidence can hide. On the surface, this appears straightforward. 1989, Jefferson nickel, Denver Mint. Look closer, however. And the condition of the surfaces becomes part of the investigation. The coin does not present itself like a perfectly preserved specimen. Its surfaces may appear dull, marked, or difficult to read. The date and mint mark are not immediately presented with the clarity collectors would prefer. For a casual observer, that can make the coin seem less interesting. Yet the closer collectors look, the more complicated the story becomes. Because surface appearance is not the same thing as collectible importance. A coin can have an unattractive surface and still contain characteristics worth investigating. Likewise, a coin can look bright and impressive while actually suffering from cleaning, chemical alteration, scratches, or other post-mint damage. That distinction is critical. Collectors don't simply ask, "Does this coin look good?" They ask, "Why does it look this way?" That question changes everything. The 1989D tells us that this nickel was struck at the Denver Mint, identified by the D mint mark associated with the issue. On a normal example, the date and mint mark should be examined carefully, but collectors also study the surrounding surfaces, the lettering, Jefferson's portrait, and the reverse design around Monticello. The strike matters, the preservation matters, and the originality of the surfaces matters. Most examples tell one story. Exceptional examples tell another. Imagine placing an ordinary circulated 1989D nickel beside a carefully preserved specimen. The difference may not be dramatic from several feet away, but under magnification, the story changes. Tiny contact marks become visible. Fine details separate themselves from worn areas. The texture of the fields becomes easier to evaluate. The lettering can reveal differences in sharpness, and suddenly the coin that looked ordinary becomes a piece of evidence. This is why professional grading can become so important. A grading service doesn't simply look at whether a coin is old. The coin's condition, surface quality, strike, signs of circulation, originality, and other characteristics can all influence its classification. Authentication adds another layer. If someone claims that an ordinary-looking Jefferson nickel is extraordinarily valuable, the burden of proof becomes much higher. Collectors want to know whether the unusual characteristics were created at the mint or happened later. Was the surface naturally altered? Was the coin cleaned? Is the apparent feature actually a minting characteristic? Could damage be mistaken for an error? Those questions matter because the difference between a genuine mint-related feature and post-mint damage can be enormous. And this is where collector psychology enters the story. Collectors are drawn to coins that require investigation. They want something they can study, compare, authenticate, and understand. The excitement isn't always created by a coin shouting that it is rare. Sometimes it comes from a coin that refuses to explain itself immediately. That is exactly what makes this 1989D interesting. The harder the evidence is to see, the more important careful examination becomes. But there is another reason condition matters. Millions of coins may have been produced, yet far fewer can survive in a truly desirable state. Circulation, storage, moisture, chemicals, scratches, and careless handling gradually separate ordinary survivors from exceptional ones. And when collectors compete for the best examples, scarcity can become more important than age. That is a crucial lesson. A newer coin can sometimes attract more attention than an older one if the surviving population in exceptional condition is much smaller. So before discussing the reported value of this particular 1989D Jefferson Nickel, the evidence has to come first. Unusual appearance alone isn't enough. A difficult-to-read date isn't automatically valuable. A strange surface isn't automatically a mint error. And a D-mint mark doesn't create rarity by itself. The coin needs a documented reason for its premium, exceptional preservation, a recognized variety or error, authentication, certification, credible market evidence, or another characteristic collectors can verify. Only after those questions are answered does the price become meaningful. And that brings us to the figure associated with this final coin, $215,000. A number like that should never be treated as the guaranteed value of every 1989D Jefferson Nickel. Real-world values depend on authentication, grade, condition, rarity, provenance, and actual market demand. But the number illustrates the central mystery that has followed all three coins in this documentary. The value isn't sitting on the surface waiting to be read. It is hidden inside the details. The first coin taught us that an unusual surface can demand investigation. The second showed us how preservation, strike quality, and condition can separate an ordinary survivor from an exceptional one. And this final 1989D brings those lessons together in the most important way. A coin doesn't have to look extraordinary to deserve extraordinary attention. The real collector doesn't stop when the coin looks ordinary. That's when the examination begins, because somewhere beneath the worn surface, beside an overlooked mint mark, around a difficult-to-read date, or inside a tiny design detail, there may be the evidence that changes the entire story. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson these three Jefferson Nickels leave behind. Millions of Americans once spent coins like these without giving them a second thought. Today, collectors hold them under magnification. Compare their surfaces, study their strikes, verify their authenticity, and search for the tiny differences that history left behind. Three coins, three different mysteries. One unforgettable lesson. True value is often hiding in the detail almost everyone else ignored.